big focus for us is finding out how our adversaries are using big data against us.
Foreign actors will view the 2020 U.S. elections as an opportunity to advance their interests.
But I think China writ large is the most significant counterintelligence threat we face.
The underlying political and economic factors that facilitated the rise of ISIS persist.
There still is a substantial military capacity that Kim Jong-un wields.
The Iranians are considering taking steps that would lessen their adherence to JCPOA.
It's always interesting, the threat assessment, the intelligence leaders for the Trump administration talking about threats from around the world, at sometimes varying with the president's description of some of those areas. But what about all of that? Let's bring in our panel. Byron York, chief political correspondent of the Washington Examiner. Mara Liasson, national political correspondent of National Public Radio. And Molly Hemingway, senior editor at The Federalist. Byron, I was struck by the election focus. There was a lot on election interference. Chris Wray saying that not only did Russia try in 2018, but they believe that Russia and China are really going to try to step it up in 2020.
Actually, I think perhaps the scariest sentence in the whole report was the one that said China and Russia are more aligned than at any point in the mid-1950s. That is not good at all. And you're right about the election interference. On the other hand, I think we've been expecting this for at least four years now. One of the things that I thought was really striking about this report was that a lot of it just wasn't very surprising given the news. That when the report comes out and says that North Korea wants to build nuclear weapons and wants to build the missile delivery systems to attack the United States or somewhere else. I mean, the shocking thing would have been if they weren't. So there was a lot of news in here that we really already knew.
Yeah, I mean, Mara, gives it context. The Trump administration, the president may point back to North Korea and say, listen, they haven't fired missiles over Japan. Right. We're still talking, and they haven't tested any nukes.
Yeah.
Are they developing more stuff? That's what the intel people say.
Right. Now, that's quite different than him tweeting North Korea is no longer a nuclear threat. But I thought that was a pretty serious warning. They not only said that North Korea was doing all those things, but they said that North Korea would not give up its nuclear weapons.
Right.
So that is setting the stage for this upcoming meeting between the president and Kim Jong-un. It's going to be a lot harder, I think, than maybe Donald Trump thought to get North Korea to make the kind of deal that he wants. But I think you've heard the intelligence community say this before. Remember right after Helsinki when they all came to the briefing room at the White House to say how seriously they took Russian and other countries' efforts to intervene in elections. So they've been clanging the alarm bells for quite a while.
Molly, what'd you see?
I read the report as well, and I thought it was interesting how frequently Russia and China were linked together as the same threat. It would have been nice to see what percentage of the threat comes from China, what percentage from Russia, because it's hard to determine which one is the greater threat. But historically speaking, what the U.S. has always tried to do is make sure that Russia and China are not in cahoots together. It's why sometimes you're friendlier to China and sometimes you're friendlier to Russia, knowing that when they work together, that's a combined adversary that is very, very difficult.
Here's the FBI director on China.
We have economic espionage investigations, for example. That's just one piece of it in virtually every one of our 56 field offices. And the number of those has probably doubled over the last 3 or 4 years. And almost all of them, not all of them, but almost all of them lead back to China.
Which is pretty substantial, Byron.
Yeah, that was really striking, and it's one of the things that, contrary to a lot of the headlines, there was not a lot of difference with the president's position on that. So, I mean, here again, there was this emphasis on the intel chiefs coming out and disagreeing with the president on all these fronts. And yes, there was some of that.
Well, here's one. Here's one that was clear. I mean, the ISIS depiction and how it's talked about was a lot different.
We have won against ISIS. We've beaten them, and we've beaten them badly.
The group has returned to its guerrilla warfare roots while continuing to plot attacks and direct its supporters worldwide. ISIS is intent on resurging and still commands thousands of fighters in Iraq and Syria.
My amendment would acknowledge the plain fact that al-Qaeda, ISIS, and their affiliates in Syria and Afghanistan continue to pose a serious threat.
Molly?
Well, this is one of those areas where the president is speaking about what the orders were for the Pentagon for our involvement in Syria. They were told to make sure that ISIS doesn't control all that land that it had, 40,000 square miles. And in fact, as we saw tonight, it's down to one town that is surrounded. Now, if people want to change what the determination is for why we are there, they're more than welcome to do that. Congress is more than welcome to make the case that we should be at war in Syria for up to 18 years, which is what we are currently in Afghanistan for, and make the case that involvement makes sense and that expense of money and lives is something that's in the U.S.'s interests. But as far as the question of whether we achieved what we set out to do, there is no question that we did defeat ISIS as a landholder.
Yeah, and let's just make clear, there's not a lot of nuance in the president's Twitter feed when he says these things, you know. I mean, and there's a lot of detail in those testimonies.
In this case, you know, when it comes to holding land to go from 40,000 miles to one town that's currently surrounded by fighters, that is the objective we set out to do. That is what we did. And it's this creep of mission that enables people to be in areas for decades or more, this changed idea about what it takes to achieve victory.